Good afternoon. My name is Jim Conlan and welcome to the latest episode of our sports show. As you know, we've been previewing and airing our upcoming documentary, Global Rugby Legends, My Life in Rugby. We're looking to iconic rugby players from the Northern Hemisphere, Scotland, Wales, England, Ireland, France and Italy, and the Southern Hemisphere, South Africa, Argentina, Australia and New Zealand. Talk about the highs and lows of their career, how they came about to start in rugby in terms of the highs, World Cups, Six Nations, Five Nations, Tri-Nations, Heineken Cups, etc. And our guest this evening is a Scottish player. He's appeared 23 times for Scotland, scoring 9 points. He's also been on 2 British and Irish Lions tour. He made his debut in 1992 versus England. He captained the back team in 1997 and between 97 to 99 to Heineken Cup victory in 98. When they beat Brive, the French team. It was Lions tour of 97 and playing New Zealand, and he was in the 01 tour of Australia, and he captained the Scottish team in 2000 that beat the England, the old traditional rival that stopped them winning the Grand Slam. The one and only Andy Nicol. Andy, first of all, I spoke to Craig Chalmers and I spoke to Scott Hastings, and that Scotland team that won the Grand Slam in 91, and you come around the year after in 1992, the highlight of Scottish rugby in 1991. Is it sort of eke in you sort of these years later that maybe if it was maybe that 18 months later I'd have a Grand Slam medal in my pocket?
Yeah, well, Jim, maybe you want to do it again. It was 1990 was the Grand Slam.
Oh, 1990. Perfect. I'll
read the question.
Yeah. 3, 2, 1. I suppose, Andy, when you look at, you made your debut in 1992, obviously with Scotland against England, and you saw the Grand Slam team of 1990 and all the success they had, the highlight of Scottish rugby, med legends of the Hastings and Chalmers and a few more. But you started looking at yourself and you look back in the lost career and say it was only that 2 years earlier.
Oh, Jim, I was just so delighted to get my first cap, and I was 20 years old, so quite young, and I'd stood in the terracing for the Grand Slam game against England in 1990, and so I looked up to all these players like David Soul, the captain, walking out of Murrayfield in that iconic moment, and Derek White and Kenny Milne, all the forwards that were still there, Chris Gray, Damien Cronin, and Finlay Calder had retired by the time I played. But yeah, I basically joined the backline that Gary Armstrong was injured in 92, and I basically joined the Grand Slam backline with Craig Chalmers at standoff, Scott Hastings and Sean Lanine in the centres, Ivan Tucholo, Tony Stange in the wing, and Gavin at full back. So it was just, for me, it was just brilliant to join those players in the Scotland team. And so, if you've won a Grand Slam 2 years earlier, here we are, 22 years on from 32 years on from that moment, and you think, well, Scotland haven't won a Grand Slam since. When you're only 2 years on, you think you can still do it. So I thought I was joining a great side that we could do great things with.
And I suppose, Andy, you grew up in Dundee. I suppose people, when think about Dundee, my first impression when I think of Dundee and I hear the name Dundee, I hear Dundee United, I think of football, I think of Scottish, I think Dundee, apart from Glasgow, would be a big traditional powerhouse in terms of football. When I think of rugby in Scotland, I think more Edinburgh in terms of my direction. So growing up in Dundee and a family, what was the first affiliation for you growing up? Did you find rugby at a young age? Were your family all soccer supporters? Dundee United, Dundee United, and the other Dundee team as well is just slipping my head.
No, you've got it right. It's Dundee United and Dundee, and I am a Dundee United man. So okay. And families can be split in Dundee accordingly. So listen, I played a lot of football as a kid. I swam a lot as a kid, but rugby, and I played a lot of rugby. My grandpa, George Ritchie, got capped for Scotland in 1932. out of Dundee High School FP, the club that I ended up playing with. Chris Ray came through, who went in the Lions tour in 71. He went through Dundee High School, and so did David Leslie, the great flanker from Dundee. But they all had to leave Dundee. Both Chris and David left Dundee to get capped. I actually left school in '89, went to Edinburgh. Played for Heriots for a year because the quality of rugby in Dundee wasn't high enough really to play international rugby. But after a year, I decided we got promoted to the second division, and I decided to go back because I was so passionate about Dundee and getting the rugby in Dundee up a level. And so David Leslie, who's now coaching Dundee High School by this stage, he asked me to come back to spearhead the challenge to get promotion to the first division. And so I did. And Sandy Hutchison was my rugby coach all through my school career in Dundee. And he was the assistant coach at the senior rugby club. And so it was a massive thing for me to get my first cap out of Dundee. The first player to do it since my grandpa had done it 60 years before me. So he got his first cap against England in London at Twickenham in 1932, and I got my first cap against England at Murrayfield in 1992. So fantastic for my family, but it was fantastic for Dundee, Jim, that all the kids could see that they could stay in Dundee and be an international rugby player, because everyone up to that point had to leave Dundee to be a rugby player, an international rugby player. So it was huge for the city.
And I suppose, Andy, in terms of Dundee, and obviously we know rugby was an amateur game and it didn't turn professional until later on in the late sort of 90s and sort of such. So obviously growing up, parents, academically, a household, did you come from a middle class household growing up in terms of opportunities, in terms of education? What was the parents, what were they trying to say to you to go down? Did they want you to take up an apprenticeship, take an electrician, a mechanic, go into woodwork? Brothers, sisters, were you the most gifted sports-wise in the family, or did you have brothers or sisters who were talented at another sport at a very high level as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm from a family of 4 kids. I've got an elder sister, Kirsty, who's 7 years older than me, then Alistair, 6 years older, than Ian, 4 years older than me. So I was the baby, but so there was huge amount of talent in my siblings. Brains and sporting ability were inversely proportioned. My sister was very brainy and was head girl at the school, and just got A's across the board. And then my academic wasn't as good as hers, but my sporting ability was good. But my eldest brother, Ali, he played for Scotland at under 17 level, and was a very talented rugby player. My brother Ian played for the school first 15. So as I say, our dad played, and then obviously, as I mentioned, my grandpa had played for Scotland. So rugby was always in the genes. But I wanted to, and we were I guess a middle class family. We enjoyed all the opportunities that growing up in the 70s and the 80s, the freedom that you had. As I said, I swam a lot, I played football, I played rugby, and it was just a great way of learning different sports. And I think you take inspiration from those above you. And my brother Ali was a scrum half, and he was 6 years older, is 6 years older than me. So I kind of looked up to him, and that's why I played scrum half. He was probably the more traditional size for a scrum half back then, and I was a bit taller, and but that was the reason I played scrum half, because he played scrum half. So I played 14 years of senior rugby. I played 28 years rugby in total when I started playing mini rugby for a club called Panmure Mini Rugby Club in Broughty Ferry, Dundee. And I only played 2 games, not at scrum half. And so that was probably not the right thing to do. I've always recommended to young kids to play as many positions as they can, so you can find out what you like, and your body changes, your height changes, your weight changes possibly over the years. But I didn't do that. I just stayed at scrum half because my best mate was the standoff, and we started playing mini rugby together age 6 years old, and I was scrum half, he was standoff, and we went through our mini rugby together, our school together, and actually then played for the senior club, Dundee High School FP, together. So that was the normal out from a scrum half, would be to go one position out to stand off. But Johnny Newton was always there, so I never did.
I suppose I spoke to Craig and I mentioned about the great battles that Scotland and England had in terms of the Six Nations in the early sort of 90s. And you were the two sort of dominant powerhouses. The French would come again the odd few years with a really sort of good team. And obviously Ireland and Wales, a few lean years in the sort of early sort of 90s. And it was Scotland and England that sort of went sort of toe to toe for those many years. And I asked Craig about it, and he's obviously felt maybe that Scottish team he was on maybe underachieved in terms of that. Do you look at maybe some of the talent that he had back then, Andy, in terms of 92, 93? Do you think you could have achieved a bit more than what you achieved?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, I said we came off the back of winning should have won it in 89, possibly. We were right up there. 1990 Grand Slam, 1991 semi-final of the Rugby World Cup, and a goal kick, a penalty kick from Gavin that just slipped past that he should have got. Who knows if we'd got to the final against Australia? Who knows what would have happened in that final? So we then in 92, 93, 94, there was chances. I would say though, once we got to 96 and the game went professional, where Scotland had an advantage over certain teams was that we always could be fitter than them, and we weren't as big as, say, England and France, but we could be fitter than them. When professional rugby came along, that leveled that playing field, and it meant that ability and the number of players you had became quite an important factor. So I think we probably missed that opportunity before the game went professional to have got that success and maybe won a championship. We won the championship, obviously, in 1999. The last Five Nations, we're still the reigning Five Nations champions in Scotland. And we had a couple of Grand Slam deciders in 95 and 96, I think it was, but we never won them. So we never really, we didn't win anything really, but and then professional rugby kicked in, and there was a bit of a lag after it started in 96. And then it's become a bit of an uphill battle, really, because it's a lot of professional rugby, professional sport is a numbers game, and we've only had two professional teams at the top of the game, and that just narrows the top of the pyramid. It's difficult, and so it has been a challenge. But I do look back in my early stages of Scotland and think, we possibly could have won a bit more.
And Andy, obviously you mentioned the game turned professional, and there was a big scramble around for players. We know here in Ireland, David Humphreys was snapped up in terms of went over to England from Ulster. Obviously, they came knocking. The English clubs came knocking in Ireland. They came knocking in Scotland, and was the opportunity to go to youth to bat to be a professional rugby player to get a set sort of salary on a yearly sort of basis. Was it too good to ignore that sort of opportunity to play Premier League? And was there any other tempters apart from that?
Well, I went down when it was amateur, so I graduated in '94, and I'd wanted to go to broaden my horizons. By this stage I'd been lucky. I'd been playing 3 years international rugby. I'd been on the lines in '93. I'd met a number of players playing in England, like Jason Leonard and Peter Winterbottom, on a tens tour to Hong Kong, and I just wanted the experience of going down to play in England. As I say, grew up in Dundee. I was playing for Dundee. I was a big fish in a small pond, and I wanted to go and challenge myself. And so I had an opportunity to. It was before agents. This was 1994. So as I say, the game was still very amateur then. Professional rugby came very quickly, and it wasn't the Rugby World Cup in '95, and then the following year '96 when we went pro. But it happened very quickly. So '94, it was still very much just an amateur game. And then I was close to joining Gloucester, but then Bath came involved, and Brian Ashton called me, and I gave my answer immediately, because Bath were the most dominant of amateur sides. down in England, and it was I went from being the only international at Dundee to being one of 23 internationals, I think it was, in Bath, and the only Scotsman. So it was, and a Scottish international as well, not an English one. So you had to fight your corner, and I loved it. I loved the challenge. I loved the fact that there was success there, and we had to keep it going. And I got the end of the amateur dominance, and then we went professional, and it was a bit of a struggle, and we weren't alone in that. I think somebody described Bath, I think, perfectly, as we were the most professional of amateur sides, but the most amateur of professional sides when the game went pro. And so, winning the Heineken Cup in 1998 was fantastic, and it was the holy grail for Bath Rugby Club, because we dominated the English game, and we always felt that we were one of the best teams in Europe, but we couldn't prove it. So then when the Heineken Cup came along, that was it. That was the holy grail. And so for us to win it in 98 was just fantastic, and for me to be captain of that great club was a huge honour and a massive privilege, and without doubt the highlight of my career.
And Andy, we know here in Ireland the competition that happened in the early years when Conor Murray came into his pomp, and the battle between Murray and Stringer for the scrum half jersey, and it was Ecclevor who was going to get it in terms of each weekend out. I can only imagine what it must have been like for three scrum halves in terms of your time in Scotland, and to have three competing for the one jersey and not knowing. And obviously managements were iffy into who were they going to go with. Were they going to go with Gary Armstrong? Were they going to go with Brian Redpath? Were they going to go with Andy Nicol, as sort of such? Was there an overload of maybe quality in your position as well in terms of Scotland, that, as I know, I can only reference the Stringer Murray situation here in Ireland for a while. There was no other third person in that situation. It was just the two of them. In Scotland, there was three. It was something you'd never really have heard of, like three guys vying for the one spot. Like,
the key issue there was that if you were the third in the pecking order, you weren't in the squad. So when Conor and Peter were battling for each other, at least they were on the bench if they weren't in the team. So yeah, listen, it was difficult. They were really good players. I look back on my career and I was very proud that we were part of that era. At the time, it was a bit more difficult because sometimes I was top of the list and first choice. Sometimes I was second choice. Sometimes I was third choice, and that sort of moved around with Gary and Brian and myself. And injuries played a big part in that. We actually had quite a lot of injuries between us. That not often was the three of us all fully fit and competing. But listen, they were when you missed out in selection, you couldn't be too disappointed because you knew you were losing out to real quality. But where it was frustrating was if you did have the jersey and you played, in many ways sometimes played well, but the team lost. Because there was a genuine quality replacement, if changes needed to be made, then they could make that change. Whereas other players in the team who didn't have the same level of competition kept their place where they hadn't played maybe as well as we had, but because there was quality opposition to replace you, they could make that call. So it was brilliant. It challenged me. It pushed me on. Gary and Brian remain friends to this day. So it was a healthy rivalry, but rivalry is good. It really was. It really spurred us all on, and I like that challenge.
Obviously, a highlight and a pinnacle of any rugby player's career. I spoke to Shane Byrne from Ireland, the hooker, and he told me he had to pinch himself when he found out he was going to be a Lion. You had that honour twice, and obviously the great story about your Lion story is the start of the career, and obviously the India and the amount of years that's between them in terms of 8 years, sort of. In terms of being a Lion in 93 and in 01, it's that sort of gap it's amazing, sort of such, in terms of how it came about. And Which one was more surprising to you? Was it the 93 one or the 01 one?
Oh, the 01 ones. Because so 93, I was in the mix to be selected. They went with two scrum halves. There was only two scrum halves went out. It was Davy Morris from England and Robert Jones from Wales. And I was on the reserve list, which I was delighted to be. I went out with Scotland on a tour to the South Seas, to Fiji, Tonga, Samoa. So when Robert Jones took ill, they flew me over, sort of the relatively short hop from Samoa to New Zealand. I was there for a week basically, and I was a temporary replacement. So, but in 1993, as a 22-year-old, it was just absolutely amazing to be part of the Lions, and I loved the 6 days that I was there. I got to sit on the bench against Taranaki in New Plymouth in the North Island, and Davy Morris let me on for because he feigned an injury, because there was no tactical substitutions. It was only injuries that you got on for. So he feigned an injury, allowed me on, and I got to play 6 minutes for the Lions, and then I got sent home the next day. So it was Ian McGeechan, who was the coach of the Lions, wanted to keep me for a coach to allow, because there was a lot of injuries, and just be part of the squad, but not in the matchday squads, which I was desperate for them to agree to, but they didn't do that, sadly. So I was a student in Dundee. I was delighted to be on the Lions tour for any length of time, and so that was because I was formally part of the build up to it. That felt like it was. It was right to happen. 2001 was utterly bizarre. I mean, 2001, I'd captained Scotland during the Six Nations, and I'd played pretty well. So I kind of was in the mix again, but then didn't make selection. And then instead of going on a rugby tour, I went on a supporters tour. So I'd been enjoying all the social aspect of a rugby tour with Mick Galway, who knows how to look after himself.
He does, yeah.
Yeah, so he was my roommate for the first couple of weeks we were there, and I don't think he got jet lag for the first week, because he was drinking all night and sleeping all day. He was still in Irish time, and but then so we'd been on the pop for 20 days, and I got called in to sit on the bench for the third test, and it was remarkable. Rob Howley, whose first choice scrum half, broke his ribs in the second test. Matt Dawson then stepped up to be the starting scrum half, and Austin Healy was the third scrum half, who then was picked on the wing because of a number of injuries. And what was bizarre, Jim, they never flew in a fit and an able scrum half like Kieran Bracken, for example, who'd just come back from Canada, I think it was, with England. They thought they could get away with having Austin and Matt doing all the training during the week with not a replacement scrum half, just in case something went wrong. And lo and behold, something went wrong. Austin got a spasm in his back, and I got called in the morning of the third test. So I basically had a day. Because
you were in Australia, you got called in. If you weren't in Australia, you wouldn't have been called.
Not at all. I was basically, that was the only they couldn't find many other scrum halves. I think Gareth Edwards was there, but he was about 59 years old at the time, and they had a choice to make, and they picked me.
Andy, you would have come across Ireland in many years, and obviously Ireland through the 90s, there were some rough years until we discovered Keith Wood in the late 90s, and he sort of brought on the next generation. But you would have done many battles with Ireland in terms of scrum halves. Was there any Irish particular player in those backlines that you admired in your era that you went up against? Was it Gagan on the wing? Was it other players maybe in your own sort of position in scrum half that you sort of had a mutual respect or admiration for?
Yeah, no, I love playing Ireland, and I remember Rob Saunders came on in the scene, and I think he got his first cap as captain, which I just remember as a scrum half was thinking, wow, what a level of responsibility. And Michael Bradley, I played against in early start of my career. I was on the bench when Peter Stringer and O'Gara played their first game for Ireland, and I think that was in 2000, and it was, I mean, they were maybe no, in 99 it would have been, actually, I think. And they had, Peter Stringer had such a ropey first 20 minutes, and you just didn't think, they'd been kind of plucked from, not obscurity, they'd obviously been in Munster, but it was a big step up for them, and they struggled in the first 20 minutes, but then went on obviously to have fantastic careers. Guys like Conor O'Shea really always liked Giggs. Simon Gagan, we overlapped at Bath for a period, unfortunately, before his foot, I think it was his toe, big toe, stopped, had made him retire.
Dennis Hickey, would you?
Dennis, yeah, very much so. I did, and I've commentated quite a bit with Dennis in the latter years. I was there when O'Driscoll came on the scene. And he was just magical. Obviously, you could see that he was very special. And I've got to know Brian pretty well over the years, with a lot of things off the field with the HSBC, Hong Kong Sevens, and the Lions and things like that. But Keith Wood and Mick Galway were the two. Golf was that Lions tour in '93. We had we struck up a friendship then. And it's remained ever since. And Woody, exactly the same. And Woody's just been a great friend over many years. So there was always an incredible bond between Scotland and Ireland, because we were always the underdogs. That and way before Ireland got the success, Ireland have had the success that Scotland never got. In the 90s when I started playing, Ireland was a guaranteed win. It was. You didn't think twice about it. And then obviously since I think we won in 2010, and that was the first time, that's the last time we've beaten Ireland, so or certainly in Ireland. So it's a fixture that's moved. Professional rugby was not a friend to Scottish rugby,
but
it has been fantastic for Ireland. And so the success that Munster and Leinster and Ulster and Connacht, have had, has just bolstered it. And when you've got four proper professional teams feeding the national team, then you've got a recipe for success. And I look on in envy on what's happened in Ireland, because let's be honest, Ireland and Scotland as a country, economically, size-wise, very similar. And you look how, since professional rugby came in, the two countries' success have just gone in polar opposite directions. So fair play to Ireland; they've nailed it, and we haven't.
And finally, Andy, coming to you, if Andy Nicol had to look at the player, the young guy from Dundee, in his pomp, roughly around 93, 94, 95, competing for Grand Slam deciders against England, how do you sort of reflected that player? What was his sort of strengths and attributes as a rugby player?
Okay, I had good game sense, good game, and I think I never had the best pass. We talked about my two biggest competitors, and Gary Armstrong and Brian Redpath. Brian Redpath had a fantastic pass, and Gary was unbelievably competitive and combative, and I always sort of put myself in the middle between the two. My pass wasn't as good as Baz, but probably better than Gary's. I had better pace than Baz, probably better pace than Gary. So I always positioned myself as an all-rounder. I could do all the basic skills that were required of a scrum half, but I had good game sense. I could read a game of rugby. I could articulate what we needed to do. I could communicate that. That's why I captained a lot of the sides I played for, and that's why moving into the media straight after playing was quite an easy move, because I was just doing on TV what I was doing as a player, which was watching, looking to see what was happening, and tactically understanding what needed to happen to change what was taking place. So, I was committed. I think that was something that somebody gave me advice from a very young age. Just give 100%, because you're always being judged. You're always being scrutinized. They're always looking at you. So give 100%. So I think, I look back with a sense of pride that I did that, and you know, I could have done certain things better. I would have, you know, gone back and changed a couple of things that happened. But I look back also in a sense of pride that I maximised my career, and you know, I'm very proud of it.
On that note, Andy Nicol, a two-time British and Irish line, obviously captained Scotland on numerous occasions, captained Scotland in beating England, stopping England for that Grand Slam in 2000. Made his debut against England, capped 23 times for Scotland, 9 points, played for Bath and Glasgow Warriors, captain Bath to the Heineken Cup in 1998 as well. And Andy, such a career, been through the highs of the early 90s, bit of the lows in the late 90s with Scotland, with some great achievements for you along the way. Thanks for sharing your story with us today.
You're very welcome.
Take care. Thank you, Andy.